2026 is a failed year for Russia. I can now not just claim it as an expectation, but state it as a fact, and I can back up that fact if you'll stay with me for a little bit. Russia has really hoped to see more progress in 2026 compared to 2025, but what we saw was a slow motion driving into the wall face first. So let's look at how Russia really broke themselves against Ukraine. Hey there, Georgie here with Ukraine Matters. There's a lot of ways looking at the war in Ukraine. There's a lot of people that are going to be using the same data as I do and say things that will be completely contradictory. But I think it's a matter of perspective. A lot of people are looking at the war and the fact that the war is happening every single day. They're considering that already be a big loss for Ukraine. And I think they're true. It would be better if the war wouldn't happen. Then there are other people that are looking at this war on somewhat of a tactical level. They're looking Russia maybe sometimes capturing additional couple of kilometers, capturing an additional villages, settlement, that Ukrainian soldiers are dying every day. And they're stating that Ukraine is just very slowly losing. And there are people like me who tries to have a little bit of a bigger picture, perspective of how the war works, perspective and understanding that Ukraine is not fighting this war for the fate of a specific city, town, village, of a person, but instead it's fundamental civilizational resistance to Russian imperial ambitions, to stop Russia once and for all and secure the future of independent and prosperous Ukraine from here on forward. That is exactly the frame in which I'm looking at the war in Ukraine, and that is the frame in which I can clearly tell you that Ukraine is winning. And to start dissecting that topic, let's start by talking about a number 42,600. This is the number of Russian casualties in the month of July. It's a big number, a number that is unfortunately for Russia is slowly but surely approaching the target of 50,000 casualties each month. This was promised by Ukrainians that at that moment Russia will start bleeding so serious that it's not going to be really possible for her to sustain sending meat waves non-stop. But more importantly, we see that this trend is already happening. Thank you so much to Ragnar for providing this analytical spreadsheet. And we see here in this specific window where we see the casualties by month that in 2026, since we started, since the month of January, February, the losses of Russians have been going up and up and up and up, roughly by about 2,500, 3,000 extra each month. Russians are heading for an extinction, and they know that. I already talked about the Russian mobilization in a separate video, that it will not help them. But more importantly, Ukraine is actually making moves to make sure that Russia will achieve zero success, even if it will mobilize. We're going to come back to it. But before that, remember that we have a fundraiser running for the Ukrainian armed forces. And for Ukraine to win, they need all the help that they can get. Because while I do claim that Ukraine is winning, it is truly atrocious that we're seeing Ukrainian civilians being killed. We're seeing that Ukrainian armed forces are still fighting this war. We need to help and preserve as many Ukrainian lives as possible to make sure that Russia gets the message that they are not welcome here and they only are going to be meeting their death. So support the Ukrainian armed forces with a fundraiser, but we're moving on. Some people were still skeptical that Ukraine truly turned the tide and were expecting that during some month of summer, Russia will finally get their act together and starts assaulting Ukrainian positions mercilessly and will eventually get back to the tempo of the year 2025. That is not what we're seeing. If we look at the data for the last 5 weeks, we can see that overall, this was pretty bad for Russia. They were able to capture only meager 2 kilometers per day, 4 kilometers per day, 1 kilometer per day, or 3 kilometers per day. And in the middle week here, this is actually a plus sign. This is Ukraine regaining 3 kilometers per day during that week. Russia basically was standing still. And no other chart shows this as clear as the chart by the deep state. You can see clearly that in 2025, firstly, I was already telling that in 2025, which is that red bars of captured territory in between two yellow bars, they were, relatively high, despite me telling you that it was pretty slow. But 2026, which is closer to the right end, we see that those lines are barely achieving anything. The balance of territory captured by Russia is basically miserable. They are not advancing, period. But what is much more interesting is the orange line over here. This is the number of Russian assaults. How many times Russia has initiated clashes on the front line. And suddenly, you see that during the summer months, starting the month of May, there have been a massive intensification of combat. Russia has not stopped their attempts at attacks. Russia has been actually trying to restart their offensive operations and have been throwing everything that they could at the wall and trying to see what sticks. But nothing sticks. The only thing that sticks is the guts of Russians spilled all over Ukrainian land. And don't get me wrong, situation on the front line is still pretty intense. There are some things that are happening, but the way that they're happening has changed significantly. Firstly, the situation in the southern part of Ukraine changed, because here we saw Russians trying to flank Ukrainians and move essentially from east to west to undercut this southern defense line, to which Ukraine actually responded by launching a number of attacks on a relatively wide front in direction that would undercut Russian movement. And Ukrainians have been having success in this area. We see the videos and reports from there constantly. It is so much so that actually the latest reports are stating that Russia has basically stopped increasing the number of attacks and actually started decreasing somewhat the number of attacks. And instead, they are fortifying their positions. They transitioned from offensive to defensive posture in the south of Ukraine. Absolutely unheard of. Then there is situation around Liman, where we saw the town of Liman, which is a gateway to start threatening the key stronghold cities of Kramatorsk and Sloviansk in Ukraine, which are located right over here. Liman is a gateway town, so Russia would want to capture it. And you can see that they tried really to capture that, trying to sort of semi-encircle it. But Ukrainians, thanks to the command of Mikhailo Drapati, were actually able to undercut Russians, both from the south, trying to cut it right over here, but also we have reports that Ukrainians also attacked from the north and were quite successful. Now, Deep State hasn't updated their map yet, but we truly can believe those reports because they are factually verified. So now Ukrainians pretty much undercut Russian options around Liman, and they're not getting anywhere. The only two directions where Russians had some success, one is around the town of Rodinske, which is basically right over here. It's right behind Pokrovsk, and essentially trying to get and extend back to their breakthrough line. The problem here for Russian is that this is where they're hitting the new Donbass line, the start of Ukrainian fortifications. And we're going to get back to it, so just wait up. But the point is, while Russians did sort of capture the town of Rodinske, it's not really helping them that much. Can you remind me the date when Pokrovsk was captured and people were telling that Russia will just break through everything that Ukraine has once they capture Pokrovsk? They haven't. Now, Russia really needs to break these fortifications over there, because this is pretty much the only way that they can start threatening the part of Ukrainian agglomeration around Drushkivka. This is something that they critically need, because their second gateway town of Konstantinivka, that was supposed to be captured already some time ago, and Russia even claimed that it was captured some time ago, the reality is it's not. And the town is mostly gray zone, so some people get really confused about modern warfare. So when they see Russians posting video from the town, especially on certain outskirts, they're like, well, that's it. Russia controls this town. But that's not how it is. That's not the modern warfare. The gray area has extended significantly. And gray area means that both sides can operate in that area, sort of like a extended no man's land. So Konstantinivka is not captured. It's a no man's land. Very different things. Some analysts actually really nicely put it that Russia is present, not controls, is present in about 90% of town of Konstantinivka, whereas Ukraine is present in about 70% of town of Konstantinivka. So you see, it's not like 90 to 10. It means that it is a complete intersection of both sides. So sometimes some people might see some Russian propaganda or pro-Russian bloggers that are telling you, yeah, of course, Konstantinivka is captured. Here are the videos. But reality is it might be just partially, or Ukrainians might be just the next street. And earlier this year, I made predictions that if Russia will not capture Konstantinivka fully before the end of July, that is a complete failure for Russia this year. The claimed desire for Russia this year was to capture the whole of Donbass. Now, that was unrealistic. So the more realistic goal that was discussed, sort of like a minimal achievable goal that they wanted, is try to exit to Kramatorsk, Sloviansk, Drushkivka agglomeration. For that, they needed to approach it from three sides: from the north, from the east, and from the south. And actually also from like a southwest. That's what they hoped for, but it failed completely. So now we say already that the north direction failed, the east direction failed, the south direction also failing, and the only one that was not failing for them seemingly was Konstantinivka, because they did advance quite rapidly, but then some additional reinforcements arrived for Ukrainians, and now Russians are stuck and barely advancing. So I can clearly tell you that Russia is not achieving not just their claimed goals, not just the minimal of their claimed goals. They're not achieving even the start of their claimed goals. It's like participating in a race and running towards the start line. But I also think that even with that, that is not most damning for Russia. The most damning is this. When we are looking at the situation in Ukraine, this is what we're usually seeing. We're seeing big red controlled by Russia, and then the green part that is controlled by Ukraine. And then we see Russians are trying to capture something, so a little bit more of things get colored red. And that is true. But I don't think that that is the most important thing there is. One of the most, if not the most important thing, in my perspective, is this: fortifications. In 2022, all the way up to about mid-2025, Ukraine had systemic issue. They were really bad at building fortifications. There were countless scandals about it, specifically like when Russia attacked from the north around Kharkiv. There were supposed to be fortifications there, but they were never built. This was fixed. Not only fixed, it was fixed to an extent that it's absolutely stupefied all of the people. What happened is that over the last year and a half, while we were monitoring just how this red moves across the front line, what Ukrainians were doing is not only resisting Russia, but they were digging and digging and digging and digging and digging and digging more. And they dug so much that even a somewhat critical analyst, Clement Molin, that follows the state of fortifications, he states that he is impressed that in 2026, Ukraine dug more than 3,800 kilometers of fortifications across the country. For the first time since 2022, the state of fortifications is satisfying. That is not the word that I was expecting to hear about the Ukrainian fortifications. It was truly a big problem for Ukrainians, but they learned and then adapted. The problem for Russia is that these fortifications, they are getting built everywhere. Russia will not just kind of advance a little bit, advance like 10 kilometers, and then suddenly there will not be any more defensive positions. There will be, because Ukraine is building them like there is no tomorrow. More importantly, Clement also explains the new nature of Ukrainian fortifications, that a lot of these fortifications are built around the idea of checkerboard drone defense, essentially separating systemically this whole Ukrainian front line into this checkerboard pattern, where if Russians are spotted in some kind of a part of this checkerboard pattern, then that specific square and squares around it light up as essentially kill zones for Russians. So wherever Russians get infiltrated and detected, that whole area just instantly get covered by Ukrainian drones. This has been extremely efficient. And the problem for Russia, and once again mobilization here, is that Ukrainians and amount of drones Ukrainians are having is only increasing. Now Russia is trying to have some kind of new things, but to be honest, Michael Kaufman, one of the known analysts, he said that in the last year and a half, Russia was not really adapting to anything that Ukraine is throwing. That whatever adaptations they had are always like low-level adaptations. They are lacking the systemic approach to adapting their war machine. Whatever adaptations they're doing, it's always tactical, or if maybe there is like some small technology that is developed that we recently saw with the Russian armored assault when they have the active drone defense, which didn't work, but they tried. The point is, Ukraine has a system, a working system, a system that allows them to create any part of Ukrainian front line where they have fortifications, which is basically everywhere by now, and they're creating it into a kill box for Russians. This means that if Russia even mobilizes, then Ukrainians are just gonna swarm and destroy every single one of them. That is why, while we're seeing the increase in number of attacks by Russians, the only thing we're seeing is the number of dead Russians rising. And one would say, well, why would then Russians continue attacking? Like, how they are not knowing that they're not attacking? Well, the answer is as stupid as simple as it gets, because they're lying to each other, and they're lying to Putin, and Putin is a bit delusional and wants to believe these lies. Because we are now stepping in a whole new perception, the virtual war, you can tell. Russians just recently posted this video, which was hilarious. So on this video, if you just look at this shot, then you're like, oh, okay, so Russians are filming another guy that is capturing some Ukrainian territory. So he's standing there between the bushes and waving his flag. You're like, well, okay, so that's the proof on the video that Russians are present in that territory. Cool. But once you kind of start watching the video a little bit further, then you're like, wait, those are not bushes. Those are trees. So the guy that is there on the video is like 3-4 meters tall with like another 3-meter tall flag that he's waving. So either Russians are starting to essentially genetically modify their troops to have giants on the front line, or suddenly we're seeing something else. And obviously later as you watch the video, you see that person, that giant that was there, just kind of vanish in a thin air, because he's also an invisible man, an invisible giant, so to say. What this means is basically Russians are now using AI and everything else. As you can see, it looks like a regular drone footage. Everyone that would verify this road would say, is like, yeah, that's an actual village in Ukraine because it was overlaid on the actual footage. This is how they are reporting that Russians are fighting. They don't care what is happening on the front line. They do not care how far they're advancing or not advancing. If you can just show to the upper command a video that is a video proof that there we go, there is like a Russian Boy Scout right over there, is there waving a flag, then we're present there. We succeeded in our activities. And because Russian system doesn't care whether it's true or not, they only care to further promote people that are achieving their goals, even if on paper. That is where we're going to be devolving for the future. Russians will continue sending wheat waves, and their commanders will continue sending AI-generated lies to the upper command, stating that they are advancing in Ukraine and soon will be reaching Kyiv. So let's continue supporting Ukrainian armed forces. They have been doing a stellar job. We are almost on the finish line here, so please join now. I love you guys. Trust in Ukraine, support Ukrainian armed forces. Slava Ukraini, and I will see you next time.